Roxy Coss does far more than play tenor sax, and she's a great saxophonist at that. She composes, her first work done when she was a child. She leads a band, has 6 recordings released as a band leader. Roxy also leads a nonprofit organization that seeks to literally change the many faces of jazz. But perhaps what she does and enjoys most is to teach, to educate young people about the many facets of jazz. Welcome to Strictly Jazz Sounds, your conversation about all things jazz. I'm Steve Browngen. In this episode, Roxy Coss shares her deep thoughts and intense feelings about her 2 major passions, jazz education and creating an environment in the jazz ecosystem that values women and non-binary individuals. When we talked in July, she and her husband, saxophonist, educator, and composer Lucas Pino, just returned from their week-long session as co-directors of the Brubeck Jazz Summit. Yes, that Brubeck-Dave Brubeck. A week-long intensive immersion of jazz education and performance for talented students worldwide. To participate, young people must have exceptional capacity, and to teach, your credentials must be superior. The summit is held, by the way, at the University of Nevada, Reno, at the Lake Tahoe campus. Roxy continued to beam from the experience. It was obvious. It was a time to engulf herself in the Dave Brubeck family legacy that inspires scores of young people and veterans alike. She saw this as a family jazz event for young musicians, nurtured by the Brubeck family, whom Lucas Pino was fortunate to befriend over the years, she says. Roxy also reveals a more personal side of herself as we talk about the social, political, pandemic-choked environment that has embraced our nation since 2016, and how these have influenced her compositions in all her 6 recordings as a group leader. In this episode, there are 2 tracks from Roxy's latest album, Disparate Parts, thanks to Roxy and the record label Outside in Music. The lineup for Part 1, The Body, and Mabes includes Roxy Coss on saxophone, of course, Mickey Yamanaka is on piano and Rhodes, Alex Wentz on guitar, Rick Rosato on bass, and Jimmy McBride on drums. Obviously, you found this podcast, but I want you to know that you can find my podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, Player FM, and iHeartRadio. Subscribe on my website, and you will be one of the first to know when the next episode is released. So thanks for listening. And now, Roxy Coss. Students are the music, here on Strictly Jazz Sounds. This is Steve Browngen. So you and your husband, Lucas, just finished the 2023 Brubeck Jazz Summit at Incline Village in Nevada. Tell me about that. How was it for you?
It was incredible. It was one of the first things we've worked on collaboratively, which is awesome. And I think the whole idea of the Brubeck Jazz Summit is to, number one, carry on the legacy of Dave Brubeck and Iola Brubeck. And Dave's career was so much about his family. And I think that the Brubeck Jazz Summit is about family. It is a family when you're there. And once you're part of the Brubeck educational programs, you continue to be part of that Brubeck family and legacy. And Lucas has a long history with the Brubeck family and the Brubeck Summer Jazz Colony when he was young, and then the Jazz Institute. He worked closely with Dave Brubeck and Chris Brubeck over the years. And so when they invited us to be the co-artistic directors this year, we were thrilled, not only because of the musical aspects of it, but just to be able to do something as a family. So it was really exciting.
What an honor to be selected to do that and spend
Certainly.
time with the Brubeck family, who is obviously, so many of my listeners would know who the Brubecks are, and their music is played all over the country.
Yeah.
So what a time. What stood out for you in during this? Was it a week? Was it a week-long camp?
It was 1 week intensive. I guess one of the things that stands out is just, those students are the music. They are the future of the music, and so to be able to be even a small part of their journey is exciting, and inspiring. And just to see the different generations working together, with all of our different faculty that we chose, with the Brubeck family, Chris and Dan and Tish being there, and actually Chris and Tish's son as well. But just seeing all these different generations celebrating this music, learning the music, loving the music, and then also delivering that to audiences. You know, the fact that they're paired with classical Tahoe allows for really cool performances to be taking place throughout the whole week. And that was a really special element.
What a phrase. Students are the music. I love that phrase. Is that something that you have perceived over time? Because you really are, you're an educator, and I haven't described you yet. And I sort of want you to describe yourself, but an educator is truly what you are.
Absolutely. You know, I describe myself as a musician, composer, educator, activist. But I think artist maybe summarizes the whole of it to me. And an artist being somebody who lives authentically and not only creates, but offers that to the world in some way. And hopefully lives up to their fullest potential of their self as an individual. And I think education is a huge part of that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be formal education or institutionalized education, but an educator in terms of, you know, as a jazz musician, I feel like my job primarily is to be a lifelong learner. And so committing yourself to learning your whole life, there's a passion about learning. And I think you can't help but pass that on, you know, and you know, economy is, of course, always going to be part of it. That, you know, there's a strange economy of jazz right now. And so part of it is, you know, that there's money in education. But I think that even if you take that out of the picture, because people might say, oh, you're just doing this to get a paycheck or something. And I think that that's kind of hilarious, because the amount that you both give and receive when you are educating or teaching or interacting with people with less experience is way beyond anything you could monetize. The amount that you're giving, I think, you know, I just told my students today, I was teaching at the Jazz House Kids Summer Workshop, and I said, I'm not here for me. I'm here for you. You know, I want to give you this. But what they don't understand maybe is that also I'm getting so much out of that in return. And it really, as an educator, I think it forces you to think about your own values, because you're choosing what you pass along, whether it's the music itself technically or ideals and values through the musical context.
When I listen to you speak, there is a real passion that comes through. And you have lived this passion really your whole life, as a musician. You were quite the student yourself, quite an impressive background. And I'm not going to go through it all, but you started playing piano at 5.
Yeah.
And then you picked up the saxophone when you were 9, and incidentally started listening to jazz at around, what, 11? Is that right?
I started playing jazz around 11. I definitely had jazz playing around the house since I was born.
Uh-huh.
My dad listened to jazz, and I have a home video I found of my grandma playing Count Basie for me when I was about 2 weeks old. So
Oh, that's great.
I think jazz was always present, but I wasn't aware of it in a way that I claimed it for myself until I started to play it. Then I started to listen more actively and more passionately.
So that was in middle school.
Yeah.
And did you just select the saxophone, or how did that come about?
Saxophone, when I started when I was 9, it was just part of the school instrumental program, and they let you choose like your top 3 instruments. I chose saxophone really because all like the cool boys were playing saxophone. But
Oh, well.
when I know, but when I went to middle school, we had a great jazz band program, and one of my favorite teachers of all time, Robert Knapp, and he really had a talent for finding somebody's real main instrument.
Oh, that's
So
great.
I was playing the alto, and he handed me a tenor, and I never looked back. I mean, at that point, as soon as I played the tenor, I kind of quit piano, quit alto. I was like, this
Uh-huh.
is my voice. And along with that was giving me recordings of tenor players and making me start to listen really actively to their voices and the differences in the sound and stuff like that. So I was lucky to have a great program and a great educator at that time, but also, a great foundation leading up to that point through my piano lessons, and through my family, which was very supportive and into music in general.
I started on baritone in
Nice.
junior high. I started on baritone. And then my band teacher, then about a quarter of the way into the school year, said, let's switch you over to tenor. And that's what I sat on. And so if you listen to all my jazz radio shows, it's heavier on tenor.
Yeah. Understandable.
Well, yeah, and my co-host was Jane Reynolds, was what is a pianist back in Madison, and she's fabulous. So you listen to her show, more piano; my show, more saxophone.
Of course.
But it was high school that you really got into Ellingtonia, isn't that right?
Yeah, well, my high school jazz band, again, we had a very strong program under Clarence Acox's uh, guidance, and we participated in the essentially Ellington competition and festival in New York, which Jazz at Lincoln Center hosts, and has become a huge phenomena. And I was able to travel to New York for that festival 3 years out of my high school career, which is
From
really
Portland, right?
from Seattle. I grew up in
I mean
Seattle, Washington.
Seattle. That's right, and Seattle.
Yeah. So that was a big deal to me. I had never been to New York until that first time we traveled there, and that opened my eyes to what a jazz musician in New York City what that might look like. In terms of what does the city look like? What are the various venues? I mean, we played on a stage at Lincoln Center, but then I also went with some friends to a jam session at Cleopatra's Needle, and so I kind of saw, and part of that was um, I was able to do that because there was a lineage coming out of my high school of young musicians following that path of going to, jazz conservatory in New York City. And so I was watching people like Tatum Greenblatt and Ann Drummond and Casa Overall and saying like, well, what are they doing? And I think Tatum was the one that took us to Cleo's, and Winton was playing, and, so
Oh,
I got a
that's
little
great.
glimpse. Yeah, it was really fun.
Casa was with you?
He also followed that path out of Garfield
Oh, he did.
into,
Okay. He
yeah,
was from Garfield.
yeah,
Oh, that's interesting. That's a whole nother
yeah.
story. But it,
His younger cousin was actually in jazz band with me at the same time at Garfield.
oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So your affinity has been carried through the work that you're doing now, even beyond what you just did with Brubeck. With all of that, obviously your influences sort of come through in how you teach. Who inspires you? Who drives your thinking about how you should instruct jazz?
The students. um, I think teaching, my husband Lucas said yesterday, when you're teaching jazz, you're a messenger of the music. And I think that's a great way to describe it. You're a messenger. So, you know, a messenger is checking in on what information is necessary in that moment. So you've got to be listening, just like you have to be listening as a musician. Like what is needed in that moment.
There are professional musicians who have been inspiring other younger musicians in the work that they have done through their teaching? And is there somebody who you see as a strong force in jazz education today?
Certainly, but I feel there's too many to name. I think that what I like seeing is that there are a lot of communities around the country and around the world that have strengthened over time. And that's exciting to me, that there are these communities of people who care about this music and are passing it along in their communities, because we all know New York is a place for jazz. And of course, because there's so many people passionate about jazz in New York, there's more numbers of people, you're going to have greatness. And so some of the greats live in New York, and there's so many, there's too many to name. But I think what's more remarkable is that people have taken it upon themselves to be a messenger and bring it back to their local communities. I think that's a really important part of the equation, especially in this time period.
So what we're seeing really is a real blossoming of education around the country. I had a conversation with Timo Volbrecht, who is the head of jazz studies, the jazz program at Brown University. And I asked him, is there too much of it going on and not enough of the street jam that should happen? You know, it's sort of like you can kind of compare it to street basketball and then basketball that you learn in school. And then there's the jazz that Kenny Barron had talked about, losing hearing the music instead of being more intellectual about it. Is there something different going on now? Or do you see what do you see happening?
Well, and I do think it's great. I should start by saying I agree that I think it's great that, and I agree that there are school programs blossoming and strengthening. I think that's a positive thing. So not to take away from that, but I do find it problematic that the majority of resources is in institutionalized jazz, which is there's overlap, but not all of these schools or organizations with jazz education are treating jazz in an institutionalized way. But we are seeing a lot of jazz become institutionalized. And what that means to me is it's put within a system of our society, which is patriarchal, which is white supremacist, which is capitalistic. And that's the antithesis of jazz, of what jazz should represent. And with that comes the problem of changing the way the information is learned and passed on, and the way that we are messengers. And what you're talking about is one specific part of that, of learning music by ear, or being able to hear what the theoretical elements that we're learning about are, you know. And I tell my students, jazz is a language, and our goal is to become fluent in that language. So developing new ways to become fluent in a language is not necessarily bad in itself. Technology is not bad in itself if it helps you towards your goal. But what the problem is we're losing sight of the goal. The goal has shifted. Instead of trying to be fluent in a language, to be able to communicate with other people, right? To express ourselves, to listen, to receive and give and exchange ideas. That's what a language is about. Now we're caught up on becoming obsessed with a dictionary, for instance, as an analogy, like the theory of it. The theory of it is not it. You know, it's like studying the English language is not the same as having a conversation with somebody.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So jazz, you know, there's nothing wrong with studying it, but the end result should still be communication.
And how it's communicated.
Yeah.
And as you know, we know about jazz with patriarchy, that whole issue, and the abolition movement that is conveying now throughout the country, and particularly in some very rich spots. And you're one of those really important people with the Women in Jazz organization?
Yeah, so I'm the president and founder of WEJO, Women in Jazz Organization, and it's now we're in our fifth year, actually coming up, I guess, 6 years. And it started as a place that I wanted people to be able to connect, women in jazz who consider themselves professional jazz musicians and women or non-binary individuals, which is basically to say the gender minority in jazz. We have a great underrepresentation of women and non-binary people in jazz in every facet, but I was focusing on performers and composers primarily, and wanting to create a space just for those people to connect, to share stories, to become educated and empowered, and to face some of the issues that come with that sort of a misrepresentation or underrepresentation. The organization is focused on three areas, which is the individual, the community of women in jazz, and the external. So how does the world deal with women in jazz, and how are we perceived, and etc. We have various programs. It's a nonprofit organization. One of our biggest programs and longest running programs is WEJO Mentors, which is a mentorship program designed for students, really students beginning their career, so around 18 to 24, and trying to pair them with somebody who's a professional who has a lot more experience in the areas that they're interested in pursuing. So that's been happening a long time. We've done a lot of work musically, so curating playlists for radio shows or playlists for streaming services. We've put on concerts, jam sessions. We had a lot of like social gatherings in the beginning, which some of that stuff lost steam during COVID, but I think we'll see the return of that coming out of this year. But, you know, as a nonprofit and an organization that is completely run by full-time artists, it's been, you know, something that we have a long list of goals, and few of them have been accomplished yet. But I think now that we have our official nonprofit status, it'll be a little easier once we can get some funding going, which of course helps all things run a little bit more smoothly with more resources. So
a little money is helpful.
Yeah.
it does grease the skids a little bit.
Affords time and energy, right?
Yes, it does. The mentorship program, tell more about that. I want to share it to my listeners and have people become more aware of that.
Totally. So again, it's called WEJO Mentors, and it's designed for pairing 18 to 24-year-olds with a professional in the industry. We typically, a season, will accept around 20 mentees, and we take great care to pair them with professionals. They are provided with a minimum of time spent with their mentor. So both people agree we'll get together for this amount of time, which is it's around 4 hours throughout the school year. It's like 2 private lessons worth and a couple conversations worth. And beyond that, there's a series of workshops and events that WEJO puts on for the mentees to either connect with each other or to learn from additional mentors in the field in very specific areas. For instance, we've done a section on like music industry in terms of publishing, copyright, licensing type things with ASCAP. We've had, you know, conversations with elders like Terry Lynn Carrington, you know, just speaking in an intimate way with the mentees. Or we've done listening parties where they all get on Zoom and listen to music together or talk about the music they listen to. So the list goes on, but the idea is just really to get them connected with each other, with this larger community of women and non-binary musicians, and get them aware of all the different facets of jazz and things that might spark an interest that they didn't know anything about, or giving them more information about the things they already know that they're passionate about.
The the industry itself has been evolving. Where do you see women now as compared to when Wejo started? Where do you see women in the industry now?
Well, there was a big reckoning right after Wejo started. So Wejo launched in July 2017. I can do math. um, July 2017. And so I think the fall, September, was when the hashtag Me Too thing happened. And closely right thereafter was Time's Up. So there was a big, I think, collective like awakening slash revolt slash awareness brought to this issue of,
Mm-hmm.
uh, sexism, misogyny, patriarchy, these structures. We also saw this, and I think partly this all collectively came about in this time because of Donald Trump's election campaign and the things that followed shortly after with the Supreme Court and appointment and on and on and on. So the political landscape, I think, created the setting for this conversation to happen in our greater collective consciousness. And jazz was not outside of that. And jazz is a place where I think we actually represent a more extreme version of what's happening. It's very terrible in jazz. It's I still, when I went to college, I was one of, I think, 4 young women in the jazz department out of about 85.
Oh,
And when
geez.
I go visit college programs now, jazz departments, it's the same ratio, almost everywhere.
Still.
It's the exact same. So has it changed? Yes, in the way that there is a better expectation. Young people expect better.
Mm-hmm.
The standards have raised in terms of how are we allowed to act. Getting called out on things happens more frequently and for lesser degrees of problematic behavior. But I think that's being driven from our general cultural awareness. I don't think that's coming from jazz. I think it's almost, the problem of jazz is that it's an art form, as we said, for all the good reasons. It can also be a bad side effect, which is it's being passed along through mentorship. It's a cultural music. It's a cultural coming together of different opinions. But we have people who are 90 still influencing the culture. You don't have that in other fields.
Yeah.
They retire.
Well, the thinking hasn't retired, obviously. When you have groups, and I'm constantly on the watch for this. When you have the real successful groups, still it's the boys talking to the boys grabbing them and giving them opportunities and not providing any opportunity for women, and it's very discouraging to watch this happen. I'm not going to name names, but I see groups forming, and for my listeners, this is really the way that happens. That you have groups forming, reforming, and then reforming again, and reforming again, and they sort of look at each other as everybody staring into their belly buttons. That is their thinking. It's what happens, and they don't spend the time and create the space for women to be part of that project development in those types of groups.
Right.
That's what I'm seeing right now.
And I think an interesting side note is that when we came out of the pandemic, all of a sudden, my female friends and I were texting each other going, I can't believe this bull. Like, look at all these, it's almost worse than it was before the pandemic. Like, there was sort of like we're just going to ignore that ever happened and go back to normal, which is like no women. And, people always ask me about like all women projects. And I go, okay, but you're not calling out the all male projects. Like, and I think one part of it that's problematic is, or not problematic, but I think one challenge for all of us as musicians is it is a social music, and we do want to call our friends to play this music. We can, if it's a language, if our goal is to have conversations, it's easier to communicate with your friends, and
Yeah.
it's hard enough to make jazz. You don't want to be like struggling to communicate. So I understand the challenge there, and I've dealt with this myself, which is like, do all of my friends look like me? I don't want my band to always look like me. I don't want my friends to always look like me. I want different opinions. I want different perspectives. But that's an easier path to take. We are put in those cliques by the outside world constantly. And so it does take action to be deliberate about who do I want to spend time with, whether that's musically or not.
One musician that I spent a little time with was Joanne Brickeen. And for listeners, she is just one of the most outstanding pianists I've ever heard.
Yeah.
And a really remarkable person. And time after time after time, when I've seen her play as a side person in groups, she's the only woman, and it's recording after recording after recording, and it's very disturbing to note that she, I think, has been forgotten by so many people, and she's still teaching, which is remarkable given her age. And I don't understand how these groups who profess to be so forward-thinking could forget so many of the quality musicians who were out there who are women. I don't understand that. It bothers me a lot.
Definitely. But it's part of the history is that, we know this in our American history, that it's a one perspective. It's a white perspective. It's a, colonial perspective, empirical perspective. We've talked about this collectively as a society, but the same thing is happening in jazz, and it's a male perspective. Even the few women who did succeed and have careers and are great contributors to the music have largely been written out historically of the history. When we're talking about jazz history, when we're talking about, classic recordings or must-have recordings or things like this, or people to check out, and when you write them out of the history, that furthers the problem, because then other young women don't have an example or role models. So they don't see themselves in the music. So it discourages future generations when they're written out in that way.
When you're talking to a female student, and the student is curious about the life of a jazz musician, and is expressing a great deal of interest in that, what do you say to her?
Same thing I say to any gendered student, which is, it's hard. I try to be honest. This is hard. It's not easy, and you shouldn't do it if you think you might want to do something else. If you can imagine yourself doing anything else, do that thing. There's something about a jazz musician that I think everybody who does it, there's something inside you that says, I have to do this. And you're not quite right when you don't do it. It's a calling. And if you get that calling, you have to answer it. And so I feel that a student who has that calling should have all the information going in. And it's hard. But I think most things in life that are worth doing and rewarding are difficult and challenging. I mean, one of the most challenging things I've ever done is be a mom. And I think anyone with kids knows why I'm saying that. But at the same time, it's one of the most rewarding. You would never, I mean, everybody has a different experience as a parent, but I think after I had a kid, I go, oh, no one would do this if they knew how hard it was, but also you can't explain how great it is until you do it.
Yeah.
And jazz is the same way. No one would ever do it if you knew how hard it was going to be, but you can't explain how rewarding it is, and if you have that calling, we all need to do better with the issue of gender in jazz, and we need to be deliberate about what type of communities we're creating and what type of behaviors we are encouraging.
You quoted Clark Terry about persistence, and you write that he said, the only way I knew how to keep going was to keep going. How have you followed that maxim?
Oh, well, I can't even imagine what Clark went through.
Yeah.
Being a Black man, a trumpet player, jazz musician in his era. So I think, his quote is keep on keeping on. And that was his mantra. And I think it's pretty important in life, but jazz is one of these things where it's not steady. Like some jobs, you get a job, and after a while, if you do a good job, you get a promotion. And there's this linear thing happening. And let's say you want to change jobs. You're going to look for something that's either equal to or above what you're doing. That's
going to build on it.
Yeah, that's what people generally follow in our society. Being an artist of any type is not like that, right? It's not linear, and it's up and down all around. It's cyclical, and so I think the more experience I get, you realize like you just got to keep going, because you might have a great day and the next day is terrible. You might have a great month and the next month is terrible. You might have a great year and the next year is terrible. But like, let's say you start out in that terrible year, that's all you know. You're like, this is terrible.
Yeah.
But once you've had 30 years, they're not all going to be terrible. So I think it's very important in this specific field to just persist and notice bigger changes, bigger messages, bigger trends, because in general we should be trending up, but our line is much more weird and bizarre.
One of the challenging things that you as a musician, as a jazz musician, must do, and requires a lot of patience, is composing. The time, the talent that it takes to do that. You write pretty much most of the music that you have on your albums, don't you?
I have, yeah. Traditionally, I have. Yeah.
How challenging was that for you?
Well, I don't really think about things in level of challenge, but when I started piano lessons at age 5, part of my method, the technique I was learning was, it was based in theory, ear training, and composition. So I was composing from the time I started studying music. So it's always been part of my practice, which makes it normal for me. It makes it, so that I've had experience doing it. And it's, for me, one of the most meaningful parts of being a musician is a composer, because I feel like I can express myself in a very different way as a composer than a saxophonist. And so it's important to me that I have that element of my artistic practice going, not constantly, like nothing is constant, but as a general overall part of it. And I feel like when I go into composition mode, that I go into my own world, that I get to make up all the rules. I get to make up that little world. And that's fun for me. That's kind of like imagination time. And then as I get more experience in music, and I am able to more clearly understand and define those sounds, then you just get more freedom to explore new places and get deeper with your expression. So I think it adds a challenge to say, I'm going to record original music, because it just adds another step of work that you're doing as the artist, rather than just taking someone else's composition and playing it. but for me, it's important to express that side of my artistry. That doesn't mean that I don't or won't. I have in the past. I'll continue to also record other people's music because I think the more music you learn, the more you can deepen your own contributions as well.
Yeah, whatever you hear, whatever you're listening to does find its way in your music.
Exactly. And I think a lot of what music we create as a composer, anyone, is borrowed and regurgitated, but it's coming through your filter, your personal take on things.
Your life filter. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. It's certainly true of improvisers, but it's also true of composers.
I was reading about another major soprano saxophonist, Jane Ira Bloom, and how she perceives composing, and she too sees this combination. I mean, they're intricate with each other, composing as well as improvising. They go together.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you're playing, you see that as a very critical part of how you approach it.
I like to define improvisation as composing in the moment.
Yeah.
So they're very related, yes.
What was the impact of your 3-year residency with your quintet at the Smoke Jazz Club?
Yeah, well, I think in general, as a band leader, my experience, I've been very fortunate to have multiple residencies over the years. I first became a band leader during college, but professionally, that was in 2008 after I got out of school, and I created a gig for myself at a restaurant down the street. And so that was my first residency. And that was when I really had a chance to work on my compositions and work on my band leading skills for the first time. We had, every week you get to try the music in front of people. And another thing that I say to my students, it's like you have to practice everything you do. So you have to practice performing. If you only practice in the practice room, then you're going to be good at practicing, but you're not going to be
good in the practice room. Yeah.
You're not going to be good at performing because you've never done it. So I am very grateful for that early experience of having the chance to perform weekly in a very low stakes environment, but also that I took advantage to say, I'm going to rehearse the compositions every week to be ready for that performance. And that led to the formation of the first Roxy Coss quintet, which had trumpet instead of guitar, and my first debut album, which I recorded on my own in my apartment. But
the self-released one, the self-titled album, Roxy Coss.
Yeah, exactly. And then the second residency I had, which you're referring to, was the Smoke residency, and that came about. I think primarily I at that time was forming a relationship with Jeremy Pelt and playing in his band, and that musical connection opened me up to that opportunity. And to lead a band at Smoke was really, again, I'm grateful for that opportunity because that was a level up for me. That was like, I'm still leading a band and it's every week, but this is a bigger stage. This is a well-known jazz club. And with that comes a level of pressure, which forces you to get better at performing, better at band leading. So I wanted to try something new in this new setting, and my relationships musically had changed. And so I started a new version of the band, which led into the modern instrumentation of my Roxy Coss quintet with guitar. And I had met Alex Wentz through a different band leader around that time. And so he became the guitarist back then. And that second album that I recorded came out of that time period. So I actually ended up recording with Jeremy on it, and Chris Padishall, who was my pianist for a long time during that Smoke residency, as well as Desron Douglas and Willie Jones III. And I had been invited to do a tour with Jeremy, Desron, and Willie, and I really loved that chemistry. So I wanted to kind of bring that to what band I had started to create through that Smoke residency. So it just helped continue for me to develop my band leading skills, performance skills, composition skills, and producing skills, which, you know, each one of those things takes a lot of time and energy to develop, I think.
The business of playing music, is that being taught more often now, or at least made available?
I think every program now claims to have an acknowledgement of jazz business somewhere in there, but I don't think we talk about it enough. I think that the model of conservatory is leaving students ill prepared for a real world in music, because being a musician, this much of your life is music.
Yeah.
You are a freelancer, you're a business owner, you're either a band leader or a side musician or both. You know, you have to know how to have opportunities to make music and how to make a life out of that. You can't just play into a void unless you happen to be independently wealthy.
There's branding, there's marketing, the promotion work that you have to do to get yourself moving. If you can't advance your own professional career, then you probably won't find that gig.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a dirty word. It doesn't have to be one thing. You know, my way of being business wise is going to be different than another person's way of being business wise, but we can't ignore it completely.
I'm going to talk about the album Future is Female, which came out in 2018. I played that album quite a bit. One of my favorites is Mr. President. And this is referring to the guy who just got his third indictment yesterday.
When I was talking about earlier in this interview, it was about WEJO. And my development of WEJO, Women in Jazz Organization, was very closely related to and in the same time as my development of the music I recorded for The Future is Female. This was all happening in 2017. And I was filled with rage and anger and frustration, and also depression and dismay and sadness. And these were two outlets for me of how to deal with those emotions. One was activist work, and one was composition / artistry and recording that album. And I had a very strong vision for this album in a different way than the other albums I've recorded. I always have a theme for the album. I always have sort of a central idea that I'm dealing with in the project, and that comes through in the compositions. But this specific theme was about what is my place as a woman in this society and as a jazz musician. And the issues that you are referring to with Trump really triggered in me something that I felt deeply in my jazz experience. Like, you know, you show up and somebody says a comment. It's the same thing I saw Hillary deal with when she showed up to a presidential debate on a national stage, and he makes a comment that is so degrading and belittling in one moment, and nobody does anything about it. And it's totally acceptable. In fact, it's encouraged because he was elected. And that just triggered a lot for me to see that continue to play out on a national stage and be not only encouraged, but like allowed and supported. And so that specific composition was a response to those feelings for sure. And that was the most maybe literal composition on that record, and maybe at all that I've ever written. I at the time was collecting ideas of compositions I wanted to compose on my phone, just one line idea about what I wanted to write musically. And for that one, it just said, Mr. President, like that's going to be the title. And so I sat down to write it, and it was like, you know, it poured out of me. It took a while to arrange it in my brain, organize it. But, you know, what I ended up with was I wanted it to start with chaos and then it goes into these varying sections of music where it starts as a dirge, a march, and it's almost like the Death March from Star Wars,
Yeah,
the
that's great.
Imperial March, and that's him. That's him at his core. And then it starts to contrast with these more major tonality, sort of Latin groovy sections, and each section speeds up like randomly at the end of every section. We go to a new random tempo, not random in general, but they're not related. And
Right.
what this represented to me was this pretending of our society and the news outlets that this was normal. Like that this behavior was being equated as if we have to represent two sides, they must be the same and equal, and that this is acceptable and normal, like everything's fine. So that was the sort of ridiculously over the top happy sound contrasting with this minor sound, and each one getting faster, representing the chaos of us somehow surprisingly ending up with him as our president. And that's the solo section where we just play at a tempo that's slightly too fast for us.
That's a great description of what you've done. I'm very moved by what you just shared. I remember back in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was president, I had probably equal amount of rage. I had a lot of rage about what he was doing to families on assistance, breaking up families. Internationally, South Africa was a real major thing for me. And I wrote a lot of poetry at the time. I did a lot of writing. I did tremendous amount of random stuff. I was going from, one activist group to another, and I just wasn't sure what to do with all of this energy. Once I dealt with it, I became so much more focused in what I was doing. And in this album, I know it was a long road to get to this question or get to this observation, but with what you have been discussing, what you've shared, is that type of journey of trying to find how to express yourself in a way that is meaningful to you, that you needed to get something out of this in order to move on. I mean, it's an issue of moving forward in your life because you feel a little stuck, and whatever is going on is holding something back, and then you push through with this piece. That's what seems to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, yeah, you're onto something. I mean, I definitely think of my composition work as a reflection of what I'm dealing with in my interpersonal journey of growth. And that's why I end up with these themes for the albums, because inevitably in any given period of time, I think we as humans have these themes that we're dealing with. We're in this mode of our lives, we're in this time of our lives. And so when I compose, I'm trying not to think too much. I'm trying to just let whatever needs to be channeled through me to channel through me. And I think that is what my goal is in any musical scenario, like whether I'm playing a solo or composing, is to get out of my head and let whatever needs to be expressed flow through me. And I know people talk in this way about art and about higher power and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to say to describe that, I think that was happening with this composition and a lot of the compositions on this album. And it's not a coincidence. I mean, it is a personal journey. It's not selfish necessarily, but it is a way to deal with your own issues. And I feel the same way about the music on all of my albums, that it was that moment in time of the theme. And I can talk about each of them individually of what is that theme and how each of those compositions relates to that theme and represents that theme. But I think kind of the point is that, like, yes, it's a process for me as an individual. It's almost like a therapeutic process. And that's a self-driven endeavor, and it's a self-rewarding endeavor. But then your job as an artist is very important to society, because then when we speak that thing, there are people who need to hear that, who relate to that, who are maybe going through the same thing, who can't express themselves in that way. And that is meaningful. And to also reflect on our society and say, this is a moment in time and something that needs to be said in a certain way. And I'm going to say it in a way that no one else is going to say it. But it reminds me of a good friend of mine just passed away. And at her memorial service, one of her friends spoke about what does it mean to be her friend? What did it mean to be a friend of hers? And what she spoke on was so meaningful. And I thought about it later. I think because she was talking everyone there through a feeling we all had and shared. And so to hear it spoken out loud, it validates your feeling, it validates your experience, it honors that idea. And so as a composer, I think that's our job too. It's to honor these ideas. It's to put it out there in a way that only you're going to say it, but people are going to connect with those messages, and they need to hear them out loud to validate their experience. You know, it's like watching a movie or hearing a piece of poetry read out loud, where it brings you to tears because it touches something inside of you that you relate so deeply to. And so, yes, it's a personal journey to compose a piece of music. If you're being honest, it's going to express something you're going through. But then to bring it to an audience is important, and it's an important part of that journey. And then what's meaningful for me is to see how it might affect certain audience members, that they really connect with it.
Disparate parts is a whole nother theme. A lot of emotion, part of that as well. What were you going through for this album? What are you expressing?
Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about the different Roxys. And the timing is interesting. This album took a little bit longer to develop and release because we entered a pandemic and I had a baby. And so I think coincidentally, but not surprisingly, the issue that I started with when I started writing this music is the same issue that I was dealing with when I released it, which is, who is Roxy as a composer? Who is Roxy as a saxophonist? Who is Roxy as an educator or an activist? And that these Roxys were feeling very segmented and disparate. They're different parts of me, but also that they're separate. And then later, in the same way, reflecting that same idea, mom Roxy, career Roxy, wife Roxy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we all deal with this in some way or another. But again, like being a woman in jazz, not having a ton of role models of people doing what I'm doing, instrumentalists with kids and families, also married to other musicians. There are more and more, which is great because that gives us a sense of community. But really, like, who am I? How do I be all these things at once? And the realization that I was trying to portray through the music is that we can only realize our fullest potential if we can really try to bring all of ourselves to any given endeavor or moment. And so that was the issue I was thinking about. Now, musically, I represented it starting with a suite, which is the suite of disparate parts. And that is the body, the mind, the soul, or the heart and the spirit, sorry. And so each of those I tried to represent musically. The body is a very visceral song. It starts with hard rock and then it goes to hard swing.
Alex really cooks in there.
Totally. And like distorted guitar sound is the sound of the body to me. And then the mind, it's very mathematical, odd time signature, crazy melody that's hard to play. It features Mickey. I think pianists are always like the mental mind ones in the band.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the heart, it features the bass, which I think is the heartbeat of the band, and it's in 3/4. That's our heartbeats in 3/4 time. Sort of a ballad. I play more like a warm tenor sound on that one. And then the spirit, which is more ethereal. It doesn't have a constant tempo. It's a collective improvisation throughout, and it's sort of a meditation to me. And then I did write the title track, Disparate Parts, which also embodied that idea. It has all these different sections that are in different time signatures and different textures and all of that. And each person adds a soloistic element, all of the 5 parts. So Disparate Parts turned into an analogy of the Roxy Coss quintet over time. And I wanted to represent each of the disparate parts of the band. So each of them contributed as well. Like Mickey has a composition, Jimmy has a composition, Alex has a composition. And we also play free these interludes over Mickey's theme, her melodic theme.
February, yeah.
Yeah. So that was just free. And I wanted to use those as interludes, again, just marking the disparate parts of the album. But it came from that central idea about self and not segmenting ourselves into these different worlds, trying to integrate the parts of yourself.
Also on this album, there's a very special tune, a composition called Mabes.
Yes.
Who's that for? I mean, I know, but I'm just going to ask.
Yeah, for the listeners. So Harold Mayburn was affectionately known as Mabes to a lot of his close companions and associates. I met him when I was 16. He became a mentor for me. He told me about William Patterson University, which he was very passionate about. He taught there for, I think, over 40 years and would make the commute from Brooklyn via multiple buses and trains. And everywhere he went, he just said, William Patterson, William Patterson. He really loved teaching there. And so I learned about it from him first through the Stanford Jazz Workshop, which I attended and met him. And I ended up going to college there and studying with him more. And after college, would see him on the scene. Of course, he was a stalwart at Smoke. And he started coming to my gigs. He would just show up, the band would be playing at Smalls, and he'd sit there and right in the front row, he would just be so into what we were playing. And he would just be like, genius, genius. He'd be shouting from the rooftop. Saying it feels like silly at this point, but I can't express how much that meant to me to have somebody so excited about your music and about what your voice is. And, people would randomly send me messages throughout the year saying, I just saw Harold Mayburn and he mentioned you on stage in Japan or in New York or, all over the world. And just to have somebody believe in you more than you believe in yourself, I think, and I wasn't the only student of his that he did this with. And there's just something so special. So he passed away in this same time period, right before the pandemic, when I was writing his music.
Yeah.
And I wrote this tune at the same exact time as The Suite. And I realized afterwards it wasn't part of The Suite. It wasn't one of the 4 parts. It was its own thing, and it represented his spirit so well. It's really funky, but it's modern. And that's how I saw him. It's just like, he's rooted, he's funky, he's upbeat, he's so happy all the time, supportive, but it's not just like old school straight ahead. Like, his mind was always reaching for what's next. And he really supported that part of my compositional process. So I wanted to reflect that in it as well.
What a force in your life. And the latter part of his.
Yeah.
To be able to grab onto that and embrace it night after night that he was there with you. That really must have moved you so many times.
Yeah.
And it seems like it is now. So quite a recollection.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
The Outside of Music label. I've heard some good things about this label. Tell me about it. What's your experience with them?
Yeah, so my friend Nick Finzer, fantastic trombone player, composer himself, and band leader, he started this label, and he is basically running it by himself, along with somebody who ended up now being my manager, Alan Blanchard, who's also a trumpet player and was a former student of Nick's. But I think this is how things happen in our industry. And Nick saw a hole in the industry where artists in our peer group were making great music, but not really having the support to release it. And a lot of us having to self-release or release with labels that you have to do a lot of it anyway, or you have to pay them to do it and stuff like this. So I think he wanted to provide, a service basically, which is like, we're all spending our energy doing this industry work. I've already put in the work to learn how this works. I can offer this as a platform for younger musicians to release their music in a more codified way. And by creating a label, of course, label starts to gain recognition. That sort of endorses a younger musician when they want to release something. So I think what he's done is great. And I think it's super important. It reminds me of my comment earlier about, supporting those smaller communities around the country. This is a very different way of doing that. But, the fact that he's providing an endorsement for a lot of up and coming artists to release their music and guide them through that process, I think is really important. And so I was happy to join that artist's roster with him. Obviously having the trust of us already being friends and me respecting his musicianship, it was easy to say, here, what can we do? And I think also to be able to endorse what he's doing is meaningful to me. But the shape of the industry now, the labels function differently than they used to. And I've released with a few different labels now, Origin, Positone, and Outside In, as well as doing one self-released. And each method has its pros and cons. And I think we're at a reckoning, and the bigger issue is not these labels. The bigger issue is like, how do we value arts in our society? And specifically in America, where there's very little government funding, there's very little support, and it relies on small nonprofits to bolster or grant money to bolster up the careers of artists. I think it's going to be very challenging in the future. So it's something we need to deal with collectively.
You still have at clubs the tip jar.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, when you go to get your teeth done, you don't have a tip jar there.
Yeah.
You pay for it because
exactly.
it's a professional. They're doing work.
Service. And I think if we can start to realize that art is necessary, we all consume art every day. We all binge Netflix every day. And the writers are striking and the actors are striking because they're saying, look, this is necessary and you know it. We all need it. And I would say the same is true for music, and it is a necessary service that is not being paid.
Imagine the world being devoid of music. I can't.
No, nobody can. And it's completely ignorant to act as though that's realistic.
Yeah. On the upside.
Yeah.
I understand you enjoy crystals and you collect them.
Oh. I don't know how you got that information.
I do my research.
Yeah.
So I've been looking around your space there, and I haven't seen any crystals, but and actually I don't have one in my window here either. But I mean, it's not that we collect crystals, but we have them in several windows. It's just kind of a fun thing.
Yeah, no, I like to adorn myself in them typically, especially when I leave the house. Depending on what situation I'm facing, I've been getting into that more. It could be a placebo, but we do know that different like minerals or different elements have different frequencies. And so music is all about frequencies. And so I think if you've ever been to a live concert, especially after the pandemic, to me is when I realized it.
Oh, gosh,
And
yes.
you hear it, you hear the music, but you feel the music. It moves your cells in your body. So frequencies matter, and we're not always attuned to them. But once I learned that different substances have different frequencies, I got, oh, this is real, because they're going to move you,
Yeah.
right? Just like sound. So
what's next? Do you have a project in the works right now?
I may. Definitely this has been a time of transition for me in terms of I had a 4-year grant project that I was awarded 5 years ago now. And that was the local 802 Musicians Union in New York. They did an emerging artist project grant for 4 years, and it was an ensemble grant. So the Roxy Coss Quintet was awarded this grant, and that cycle came to completion, and I was releasing disparate parts at the completion of that cycle. So I sort of took a step back, and that aligned with being a new mom, and just started thinking about, what's next for me, artistically and creatively, and trying to make space for that, because I think while having longevity in a project is great, because it really allows you to develop things deeper. I just wanted to take a breath and say, like, what is the thing that needs to happen next for my music? But I am planning on going into the studio at some point in the next year, and I've been working on some composing, arranging that will probably work its way into that project. So,
to learn more about Women in Jazz organization, go to wearewejo.org. Thanks to Roxy Coss and Outside in Music for the 2 tracks from her most recent album, Disparate Parts. We listened to Part 1, Body, and Mabes. You can download or pick up her album at all the usual places. And thanks to Johannes Wallman for the theme music, which is from his composition, McCoy, which is from his album, Precarious Towers. Support local jazz and live jazz wherever you may be. I'm looking for sponsors. If you are interested, please contact me through the Strictly Jazz Sounds website. And if you personally would like to support my podcast and become a Patreon member, shoot me an email through the website. Shoot. If anything, subscribe. You'll be among the first to know when new episodes are ready for your listening pleasure. And join the SJS Facebook page. And while you're there, you can request to join my Facebook group, Jazz Enthusiasts. Upcoming episodes, they include the dynamic harpist Brandy Younger and the incomparable Terry Lynn Carrington. Thanks for listening to Strictly Jazz Sounds. This is Steve Browngen.